The police sirens wailed through Maple Ridge Estates as Margaret Thornfield stood triumphantly on her manicured lawn, pointing an accusatory finger at the modest inflatable pool in Jake Morrison's backyard. "Officer, I demand you arrest this criminal," she shrieked, her voice carrying across the stunned neighborhood. But what Margaret didn't know was that Jake had been recording everything and her own. Dark secrets were about to surface in the most devastating way possible. Sometimes the very weapon Jake Morrison had lived in Maple Ridge Estates for exactly 18 months. And in that time, he'd learned 3 fundamental truths about his neighborhood. The lawns were immaculate, the property values were sacred, and Margaret Thornfield was absolutely, certifiably insane. The 42-year-old software engineer stood in his modest backyard on that sweltering July morning, staring at the inflatable pool he'd just finished setting up for his 8-year-old daughter, Emma. It was nothing simple 12-foot circular pool that had cost him $67 at the local big box store. Emma would be arriving for her weekend visit in a few hours, and Jake had wanted to surprise her with something special after the brutal custody battle that had dominated the past. "Daddy's going to make this the best weekend ever, sweetheart," he murmured to himself, adjusting the pool's filter system. The morning sun cast long shadows across his yard, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in months: peace. That peace lasted exactly 43 seconds. "Excuse me," the voice cut through the morning air, like a rusty blade. "Excuse me, sir." Jake turned to see Margaret Thornfield marching across his lawn with the purposeful stride of someone who'd appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of suburban infractions. At 58, Margaret was the self-proclaimed president of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, a position she'd held for 7 years through a combination of intimidation, parliamentary procedure manipulation, and what Jake suspected was outright vote fraud. She wore her usual uniform, a pressed beige pantsuit that made her look like a militant librarian, sensible brown shoes that clicked against the pavement with authoritative precision, and a gold-plated HOA badge that she had custom-made and wore like a sheriff's star. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her already severe features into a permanent scowl. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield," Jake said, forcing politeness into his voice. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Margaret ignored the pleasantries entirely. Her pale blue eyes had locked onto the inflatable pool like a hawk spotting a wounded mouse. "What?" she said, each word dripping with disdain. "Is that—" "It's a pool," Jake replied, his tone still measured. "For my daughter. I can see what—" "It is," Margaret snapped. "The question is, do you have proper permits for this?" ... This monstrosity, Jake blinked. "Permits? For an inflatable pool?" Article 7, Section 3 of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association bylaws clearly states that any permanent or semi-permanent water feature must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee and properly permitted through the township. Margaret pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the pool from multiple angles, each camera click sounding like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. "It's inflatable," Jake said, his patience beginning to fray. "It's not permanent. It's not even semi-permanent. I can deflate it and put it away whenever I want." Margaret's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, Mr. Morrison, you clearly don't understand how these things work. The bylaws are very specific about pools, regardless of their construction. And frankly, this ... thing is an eyesore that's going to impact everyone's property values." Jake looked at his modest inflatable pool, then at Margaret's expression of pure disgust. "Are you serious right now?" "I am deadly serious." Margaret's voice had taken on the tone of a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. "I'm giving you exactly 24 hours to remove this violation from your property. If you don't, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the township and requesting immediate legal action." "Legal action?" Jake's voice rose slightly. "Over a pool for my 8-year-old daughter. The law is the law. Mr. Morrison, property values and community standards don't care about your personal circumstances." Margaret's smile was as cold as January wind. "Perhaps you should have thought about that before you decided to turn your backyard into a public swimming facility." Jake felt his temper flaring. "Public swimming facility? Are you out of your mind? It's a $67 pool from Walmart." "The cost is irrelevant," Margaret said, pulling out a small notebook and scribbling something down. Is compliance with community standards. And this, she gestured at the pool, as if it were a sewage treatment plant. This is definitely not in compliance. Fine, Jake said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Show me the exact bylaw. Show me where it says I can't have an inflatable pool in my own backyard. Margaret's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. Oh, I'll do better than that. I'll show you exactly what happens when residents think they can ignore the rules that the rest of us follow. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, her phone already pressed to her ear. Jake could hear fragments of her conversation, drifting across the yards, ... flagrant violation, ... property values, ... immediate enforcement action. Jake stood there for a moment, staring at the innocent inflatable pool that had somehow become the center of a suburban war. He thought about Emma, about how excited she'd been when he'd mentioned the surprise he had planned. He thought about the custody arrangement that gave him precious little time with his daughter, and how he'd been looking forward to seeing her face light up when she saw the pool. Then he thought about Margaret Thornfield and her threats, and something hardened in his chest. Not today, he said quietly. Not over this. Jake pulled out his own phone and began scrolling through his contacts. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, he'd give her a game she'd never forget. He found the number he was looking for and pressed. Dial Peterson Law Firm. This is Rebecca. This is Jake Morrison. I need to speak with Tom Peterson about a potential legal matter. Of course, Mr. Morrison. Is this regarding a new HOA issue? Jake looked at the pool, then at Margaret's house, where he could see her silhouette in the window, phone still pressed to her ear. You could say that. Tell Tom I need to know everything about HOA enforcement limits and property rights. And Rebecca, tell him it's urgent. As Jake waited for Tom Peterson to come on the line, he noticed something interesting. Margaret's own backyard was visible from his angle, and there, half hidden behind her prize-winning rose bushes, was what appeared to be a small shed or storage building. Jake had never noticed it before, but now that he was looking, something about it seemed wrong. Jake, Tom Peterson here. Rebecca says you've got HOA troubles. That's putting it mildly, Jake said, still studying Margaret's property. Tom, I need you to pull the Architectural Review Committee records for Maple Ridge Estates. I want to know every permit that's been filed, every approval that's been granted, and every structure that's been built in this neighborhood over the past 5 years. That's a pretty broad request. What exactly are we looking for? Jake's eyes narrowed as he focused on Margaret's shed. From his angle, he could see that it was larger than it appeared from the street, and it definitely hadn't been there when he'd first toured the neighborhood. We're looking for inconsistencies. And Tom, I have a feeling we're going to find some very interesting ones. I'll get started on the records pull immediately. In the meantime, don't do anything that could be construed as escalating the situation. Jake almost laughed. I think Margaret Thornfield has already done all the escalating necessary. I'm just planning to defend myself. As he hung up the phone, Jake noticed that Margaret's phone call had ended, and she was now standing in her yard, staring directly at him. Even from 50 feet away, he could see the satisfied smirk on her face. She raised her hand and made a little wave knot, friendly but mocking. Then she drew her finger across her throat in a slow, deliberate motion. Jake felt his phone buzz with a text message. He looked down at the screen and saw a number he didn't recognize. The message was short and to the point. Pool goes or you go. Your choice. MT. Jake looked up at Margaret, who was still watching him with that predatory smile. He raised his own phone and, making sure she could see what he was doing, took a screenshot of her text message. Then he typed back, "See you in court." Margaret's smile faltered for just a moment, but then she laughed a sound like breaking glass that carried across the peaceful morning air. She turned and walked back into her house, but not before making one more gesture in Jake's direction. She held up 2 fingers and mouthed the words, 2 hours. Jake stood there for a moment, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and something else, something that felt almost like anticipation. Margaret Thornfield had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd threatened the one thing that mattered most to him, his time with his daughter. He walked back to the pool and sat down, on its edge, his feet dangling in the clear water. The morning sun was getting higher, and the Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. Jake Morrison stood in the lobby of the Millbrook Township offices at exactly 9 a.m., a thick folder of documents under his arm and a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Tom Peterson, his attorney, checked his watch and nodded toward the elevator. "Ready for this?" Tom asked, adjusting his tie. "I've been ready since Saturday," Jake replied, thinking of the weekend he'd spent with Emma, watching her splash in the pool that Margaret Thornfield had tried to steal from them. "Let's end this." The elevator doors opened to reveal Township Administrator Patricia Holloway, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd been running municipal operations for over 2 decades. She'd agreed to meet with them after Tom had submitted the formal complaint about HOA irregularities, and her expression suggested she'd already done some investigating of her own. "Gentlemen," she said, gesturing them toward her office, "I have to say your timing is impeccable. We've been getting some very interesting calls about Maple Ridge Estates." "What kind of calls?" Jake asked as they settled into chairs across from her desk. Patricia opened a thick file and spread several photographs across her desk, the kind that suggests someone has been operating well outside their authority. She pointed to an aerial photograph of Margaret's property. "This was taken Saturday afternoon after our inspection. Do you see that structure behind the rose bushes?" Jake leaned forward. The shed, he'd noticed, was clearly visible, but from this angle, it looked much larger than it had from ground level. "What about it?" "It's a 12 by 16 storage building with electrical connections, plumbing, and what appears to be a small apartment set up inside, built without permits, without inspections, and without any HOA approval." Patricia's voice was crisp and professional. "Ms. Thornfield has been renting it out through short-term rental apps for the past 8 months. Tom Peterson whistled low. "That's about 6 different code violations right there." "7, actually," Patricia corrected. "But here's the interesting part." She pulled out another document. "When we confronted Ms. Thornfield about the structure, she claimed she had full authority to approve it herself as HOA president. She even produced documents showing Architectural Review Committee approval." Jake felt his heart rate increase. "But you said there were no committee meetings." "Exactly. So we did some digging." Patricia opened another file. "Ms. Thornfield has been forging Architectural Review Committee approvals for her own benefit while denying legitimate requests from other residents. She's also been collecting fees for HOA services that don't exist and pocketing the money." "How much money?" Tom asked. "Approximately $37,000 over the past 2 years." Jake stared at the documents spread across Patricia's desk. "She's been stealing from the neighborhood." "It gets worse," Patricia continued. "We've identified at least 14 violations she's issued to other residents that have no legal basis. She's been using township letterhead without authorization, impersonating municipal officials, and in some cases has been conducting illegal surveillance of neighbors." "The camera?" Jake said, remembering what he'd seen in Margaret's window. "Cameras, plural. We found 5 different surveillance devices on her property, all pointed at neighboring houses. That's a felony in this state." Patricia's expression grew grimmer. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Thornfield didn't just threaten you over a pool. She's been running a systematic campaign of harassment and fraud against your entire neighborhood." Jake felt a mixture of vindication and rage. "What happens now?" "Now," Patricia said, standing up, "we pay Ms. Thornfield a visit. And gentlemen, you're welcome to come along." The convoy of official vehicles that pulled up to Margaret's house at 10:30 a.m. was impressive. 2 township cars, a police cruiser, and Tom Peterson's silver BMW. Jake watched from his own driveway as doors opened and a small army of officials emerged, each carrying clipboards, cameras, and what appeared to be legal documents. Margaret's front door opened before they'd even reached the porch. She stepped out, wearing her usual beige pantsuit, her HOA badge pinned prominently to her lapel, but something was different about her posture. The imperious confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. "Good morning, Ms. Thornfield," Patricia Holloway said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet neighborhood. "We need to discuss some irregularities in your HOA operations." "I don't know what you mean," Margaret replied, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "I've been running this association according to proper procedures for 7 years." 7. Years. Patricia consulted her clipboard. That's interesting, because according to our records, you were never actually elected to the position. In fact, there's no record of any HOA election in Maple Ridge Estates since 2019. Margaret's face flushed red. That's a clerical error. Of course I was elected. Ask anyone in the neighborhood. We did, said Officer Martinez, the police officer who'd accompanied the township officials. We've spoken to 14 residents this morning. None of them remember voting for you. Several of them said you simply declared yourself president. After the previous president moved away, that's preposterous. Margaret's voice was rising. I have documentation of my election, my authority, everything. Yes, about that documentation, Patricia said, pulling out a folder. We'd like you to explain these Architectural Review Committee approvals for your rental property. The ones dated from committee meetings that never actually occurred. Margaret's face went pale. There must be some mistake, ... Ms. Thornfield, Officer Martinez stepped forward. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and impersonation of a public official. You have the right to remain silent. Jake watched from his driveway as Margaret Thornfield, the woman who'd terrorized his neighborhood for years, was handcuffed and led toward the police car. But as the officer was reading her rights, Margaret's eyes found Jake's across the yards. The look she gave him was pure venom. Even with her hands cuffed behind her back, even facing multiple felony charges, her expression promised retaliation. This isn't over, Morrison, she screamed as the officer helped her into the back of the cruiser. You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started. Jake said nothing. He simply pulled out his phone and took a photo of Margaret in the back of the police car, her face twisted with rage and defeat. But as the police car pulled away, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Margaret wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at his house, at the windows where Emma's bedroom was located, and she was smiling. It was the smile of someone who still had cards to play. The neighborhood meeting that evening was standing room only. Jake had never seen many of his neighbors in one place. And the energy in the room was electric. Mrs. Chen had organized the gathering in her living room, and nearly every resident of Maple Ridge Estates had shown up. I want to thank Jake Morrison for having the courage to stand up to Margaret Thornfield. Mrs. Chen began, gesturing toward Jake. Because of his actions, we've all been freed from years of harassment and illegal fees. The room erupted in applause, but Jake held up his hand for quiet. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate that, but I need to tell everyone something important. Margaret's arrest might not be the end of this. The room fell silent. David Kim, who lived 3 houses down, spoke up. What do you mean? She's in jail, isn't she? She was released on bail 2 hours ago, Jake said. And when they let her away, she made it clear this wasn't over. But what can she do? Asked Sarah Martinez from across the street. She has no authority anymore. The township has taken over all HOA functions. Tom Peterson, who'd been quiet until now, stood up. Actually, there's something else you all need to know. Margaret Thornfield has filed a civil lawsuit against Jake for malicious prosecution and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She's asking for $200,000 in damages. The room erupted in angry voices. Jake felt his stomach drop. $200,000. Would bankrupt him, would cost him his house, would destroy any chance of maintaining custody of Emma. That's insane, Mrs. Chen exclaimed. Jake didn't do anything wrong. Legally, you're right, Tom said. The lawsuit is frivolous and will get it dismissed. But Margaret knows that. This isn't about winning, it's about punishment. She wants to drag Jake through an expensive legal battle just to hurt him. Jake felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes on him. These were his neighbors, people he'd barely known 6 months ago, and now they were looking at him with a mixture of sympathy and concern. There's more, Tom continued. Margaret has also filed complaints with Child Protective Services, claiming that Jake maintains an unsafe environment for his daughter. She specifically cited the pool as a drowning hazard. The room fell dead silent. Jake felt like he'd been punched in the gut. She's trying to take Emma away from me. It's a harassment tactic, Tom said quickly. CPS will investigate, they'll find nothing wrong, and the complaint will be dismissed. But, ... But the investigation will be on my record, Jake finished. And Emma's mother will use it in court to argue for supervised visitation only. Mrs. Chen stood up, her elderly frame somehow radiating fierce determination. W.H. Tuesday morning, 6:47 a.m. Jake Morrison sat in his kitchen. 3 laptops open on the table, surrounded by printouts, legal documents, and empty coffee cups. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but his eyes were sharp with purpose. Tom Peterson sat across from him, equally exhausted but equally determined. "The metadata on these photos is a goldmine," Tom said, pointing to his screen. "Look at this: GPS coordinates, timestamps, device information. She took these photos from inside your property line at 11:30 p.m. last Thursday." Jake studied the data. "That's 2 hours after Emma went to bed. Margaret was creeping around my backyard in the dark, taking pictures of my daughter's bedroom. Window, it gets better," Tom continued. "The device signature matches the phone she used to send you those threatening text messages. We can prove she's been conducting surveillance, trespassing, and now cyber harassment." Jake's phone buzzed. Detective Sarah Walsh, the officer assigned to investigate Margaret's criminal activities, was calling. "Mr. Morrison, we need to meet. Now? I've got something you need to see." "What is it?" "I can't discuss it over the phone. Can you meet me at the station in an hour?" Jake looked at Tom, who nodded. "We'll be there." The police station was buzzing with activity when Jake and Tom arrived. Detective Walsh led them to a conference room where a dozen evidence boxers sat on the table, each one labeled with a different address from Maple Ridge Estates. "We executed a search warrant on Margaret Thornfield's property this morning," Detective Walsh began. "What we found, well, it's disturbing." She opened the first box and pulled out a thick folder labeled Morrison, Jacob's surveillance log. Jake felt his blood run cold as he saw page after page of handwritten notes documenting his daily activities, his work schedule, Emma's visitation dates, even his grocery shopping trips. "She's been watching me for months," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just you." Detective Walsh opened another box. "We found similar surveillance files on 18 different residents. She's been documenting everyone's personal lives, their visitors, their schedules, their vulnerabilities." Tom leaned forward. "This is stalking. Multiple counts of criminal stalking. It's worse than that," Detective Walsh said. She pulled out a digital tablet and showed them a detailed floor plan of Jake's house. "She's been inside your home, Mr. Morrison. This layout is too detailed to have been drawn from outside observations." Jake stared at the tablet screen, his mind racing. The home inspection. "When I bought the house 18 months ago, Margaret insisted on being present during the inspection. She said it was standard HOA procedure." "She's been planning this for over a year," Tom said grimly. "This isn't harassment. This is systematic stalking and intimidation." Detective Walsh nodded. "But here's the part that's really going to interest you." She opened another evidence box and pulled out a thick stack of printed emails. "We found correspondence between Margaret and your ex-wife's attorney." Jake's world tilted. "What kind of correspondence?" "Margaret has been feeding information to your ex-wife's legal team, details about your daily routine, your work schedule, your relationship with Emma. She's been trying to build a case for supervised visitation by providing what she calls evidence of erratic behavior." "That's conspiracy," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "She's been actively sabotaging Jake's custody arrangement." "There's more," Detective Walsh continued. "We found evidence that Margaret has been doing this to other divorced residents in the neighborhood. She's been systematically gathering information and selling it to attorneys, private investigators, even debt collectors." Jake felt like he was drowning. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the timestamps in her files, at least 3 years, maybe longer." Detective Walsh's expression was grim. "Mr. Morrison, Margaret Thornfield isn't just a neighborhood bully. She's been running a criminal enterprise out of her house." Jake's phone rang. The caller ID showed his ex-wife's name, Jennifer Morrison. His stomach clenched as he answered. "Jake, we need to talk." Jennifer's voice was cold, professional. "I'm filing for an emergency custody hearing." "Jennifer, what are you talking about?" "I know about the pool incident, Jake. I know about your confrontation with the HOA president. I know about the police involvement. Emma isn't safe with you." Jake felt the room spinning. "Jennifer, that's not what happened. Margaret Thornfield was arrested for fraud and stalking. She's been—" "I don't want to hear your excuses, Jake. My attorney says we have grounds for immediate supervised visitation only. The hearing is tomorrow at 2 p.m. The line went dead. Jake stared at his phone, then looked up at Detective Walsh and Tom Peterson. They're taking Emma away from me. Tomorrow, over my dead body, Tom said, standing up. Detective Walsh, need copies of everything you just showed us. Every surveillance file, every piece of correspondence, every single document. Mr. Peterson, I can't release evidence in an ongoing investigation, then arrest Margaret Thornfield again, right? Now for conspiracy, for stalking, for interfering with the custody arrangement. Because if you don't, an innocent father is going to lose his daughter based on fabricated evidence. Detective Walsh was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll make some calls. But Mr. Morrison, you need to understand your attorney has been building this case for months. Even if we arrest Margaret again, the damage might already be done. Jake felt something break inside him. All his careful planning, all his legal research, all his attempts to play by the rules, none of it mattered. Margaret had found a way to strike at the one thing that mattered most to him. There has to be something we can do, Jake said desperately. Tom Peterson's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed. Actually, there might be. Jake, do you remember Mrs. Chen mentioning that Margaret had been going through her mail? Yes, but what does that have to do with mail theft? Is a federal crime. And if Margaret has been systematically stealing mail from multiple residents, ... double quotes, Tom's eyes lit up. Jake, I think we just found our nuclear option. The emergency neighborhood meeting that evening was different from the previous night's gathering. This time, the energy wasn't just angry, it was focused. Jake stood at the front of Mrs. Chen's living room, looking at the faces of his neighbors, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope, I want to thank you all for coming, Jake began. As most of you know, I'm facing an emergency custody hearing tomorrow. Margaret Thornfield has been feeding fabricated information to my ex-wife's attorney in an attempt to destroy my relationship with my daughter. The room erupted in angry murmurs. David Kim stood up. What can we do to help? We need to document every crime Margaret has committed against this neighborhood, Jake said. Mail theft, trespassing, surveillance, fraud, everything. Tom Peterson believes we can get federal authorities involved if we can prove a pattern of mail theft. She's been stealing my Social Security checks, said elderly Mr. Rodriguez from the corner. I thought I was just having delivery problems. She took my jury duty summons, added Sarah Martinez. I almost got arrested for failure to appear. One by one, the residents began sharing their stories. Margaret had been systematically stealing mail, opening packages, and using the information she gathered to extort and manipulate her neighbors. But as the meeting continued, Jake noticed something troubling. Several residents kept glancing nervously at the windows, and when he followed their gaze, he saw why. Margaret Thornfield's white sedan was parked across the street, and she was sitting in the driver's seat watching the house. She's out there, Jake said quietly. The room fell silent. Mrs. Chen walked to the window and peered through the curtains. She's been there for an hour, just sitting there watching us. That's a violation of her bail conditions, Tom said, pulling out his phone. She's not supposed to be within 500 feet of any of the complainants. But as Tom dialed the police, Margaret's car started up. She drove slowly past the house, and Jake could see her face clearly in the streetlight. She was smiling, and she looked directly at him as she passed. Then she held up her phone and took a photo of the house, making sure Jake could see what she was doing. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Cute meeting. Too bad it won't matter. Emma will be with her mother by tomorrow night, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sleep tight. Jake showed the message to Tom, who immediately forwarded it to Detective Walsh. But Jake knew it was too late. Margaret had already done her damage. She'd poisoned his ex-wife against him. She'd built a false case for supervised visitation. And she'd managed to do it all while making it look like he was the unstable one. There's something else, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Something I should have told you earlier. The room turned to look at her. The elderly woman's face was pale, frightened. Margaret came to see me last week before all this started. She said she knew about my grandson's troubles with the law, and she could make things difficult for my family if I didn't cooperate with her. Cooperate how? Jake asked. She wanted me to sign a statement saying I'd witnessed you behaving erratically, that I'd seen you drinking during Emma's visits, that I was concerned about your fitness as a parent. Mrs. Chen's voice was barely a whisper. I refused, but Jake, she said. The Millbrook County Family Court was buzzing with an unusual amount of activity for a Wednesday morning. Jake Morrison sat at the defendant's table. Social media post had gone viral overnight. #Poolgate scandal was trending nationally. And the story of the HOA president who'd tried to destroy a father's custody over an inflatable pool had captured the public's imagination. Nervous? Tom Peterson asked, adjusting his tie. But not about the hearing anymore. Attorney, a sharp-suited man named Richard Blackwood, who specialized in what Tom called scorched earth litigation. Margaret had transformed herself for court gone, was the beige pantsuit and HOA badge, replaced by a conservative navy dress and an expression of wounded innocence. But Jake noticed something else. Margaret's eyes were bloodshot, her hands trembling slightly, and she kept glancing nervously at the reporters in the gallery. The viral social media attention hadn't been kind to her overnight. She'd become the face of HOA tyranny, and the internet's judgment had been swift and merciless. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Wells. Judge Wells was a veteran, family court judge with a reputation for cutting through nonsense and protecting children's interests above all else. She took her seat and surveyed the packed courtroom with raised eyebrows. "This is highly unusual," she said. "Mr. Blackwood, why is my courtroom full of reporters for what should be a routine custody modification hearing?" Margaret's attorney stood up, his confidence already seeming forced. "The truth about Ms. Thornfield's criminal actions. The public interest in this case stems from the serious nature of her alleged crimes." Judge Wells held up her hand for silence. "Before we proceed, I want to address the elephant in the room. Ms. Thornfield, I understand you're currently facing multiple felony charges related to your HOA activities." Margaret's face flushed red. Judge Wells opened a thick file on her desk because I received some very interesting documents from the prosecutor's office this morning. "Detective Walsh, would you please stand?" Jake turned to see Detective Walsh rising from the gallery. She walked to the witness stand with a folder of evidence that Jake recognized from yesterday's meeting. "Detective Walsh," Judge Wells continued, "please tell the court about Ms. Thornfield's surveillance activities regarding Mr. Morrison and his daughter." Margaret's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. This is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial." Overruled. "The court has a responsibility to ensure that custody recommendations aren't based on illegally obtained information." Detective Walsh, proceed. "Your Honor, our investigation has revealed that Ms. Thornfield has been conducting systematic surveillance of Mr. Morrison for over 18 months. We found detailed logs of his daily activities, floor plans of his home, and extensive photographs of his property, many taken from inside his property line without permission. Furthermore," Detective Walsh continued, "we discovered that Ms. Thornfield has been in communication with the petitioner's attorney, Mr. Harrison, sharing this illegally obtained information to build a case for supervised visitation." Jake watched as Jennifer's attorney, David Harrison, paled visibly. Jennifer herself looked confused and alarmed, clearly unaware of the extent of Margaret's involvement in her case. "Your Honor," Margaret's attorney interrupted, "even if these allegations are true, they don't negate legitimate concerns about Mr. Morrison's parenting. Actually, they do." Judge Wells said coldly, "Detective Walsh, did your investigation reveal any evidence of unsafe conditions or erratic behavior by Mr. Morrison?" "None whatsoever, Your Honor. In fact, our investigation revealed that Ms. Thornfield has been systematically harassing multiple residents of Mr. Morrison's neighborhood, stealing mail, conducting illegal surveillance, and using gathered information for extortion and manipulation." Judge Wells turned to Margaret directly. "Ms. Thornfield, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations?" Margaret stood up, her composure finally cracking. "Your Honor, I was trying to protect that little girl. Jake Morrison is unstable, reckless. He puts children at risk with his poor judgment." Judge Wells asked, "The pool. He installed an unsupervised swimming pool without proper safety measures. Children could drown. Ms. Thornfield, the pool in question, is an inflatable structure that can be set up and taken down at will. It requires no permits and poses no safety risk beyond that of a bathtub. Your characterization of it as a drowning hazard appears to be deliberately misleading." Margaret's face was now bright red, her voice rising to a near shriek. "He's turning the neighborhood against me. He's organizing his neighbors to harass and intimidate me." "Ms. Thornfield," Judge Wells said sharply, "you are currently facing charges for fraud, embezzlement, stalking, and conspiracy. Mr. Morrison is facing no charges at all. Your credibility in this matter is frankly non-existent." But Margaret wasn't finished. Years of unchecked power and control had finally broken her, and she turned toward Jake with pure venom in her eyes. "You want to know the truth?" she screamed. "I've been watching that house for 2 years. I know every person who goes in and out. I know about his drinking, his late-night visitors, his complete disregard for his daughter's well-being." Ms. Thornfield, her attorney, hissed, grabbing her arm. "Stop talking." But Margaret shook him off, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "He doesn't deserve that little girl. She should be with a proper family, not some divorced loser who can't even maintain a decent lawn." The courtroom was dead silent. Jake felt his heart pounding as he watched Margaret's complete meltdown, but he also felt something else: pity. This woman had become so consumed with control and power that she'd destroyed her own life trying to destroy his. Judge Wells' voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Miss Thornfield, you've just confessed to systematic stalking and harassment in open court. Bailiff, please escort Ms. Thornfield to the holding area. I'm issuing a bench warrant for violation of bail conditions." "No," Margaret screamed as the bailiff approached. "You don't understand. He's the criminal. He's the one who..." But the bailiff was already leading her away, her voice echoing down the hallway as she continued her incoherent rant about property values and neighborhood standards. Judge Wells turned to Jennifer and her attorney. "Mrs. Morrison, in light of what we've heard today, do you wish to continue with your petition for supervised visitation?" Jennifer looked shell-shocked. "I had no idea that the information we received came from illegal surveillance. I believed there were legitimate safety concerns. Mrs. Morrison, based on the evidence presented today, in fact, it appears that he's been the victim of a systematic campaign of harassment and false accusations." Jennifer's attorney leaned over to whisper something to her, but she shook her head. "Your Honor, I withdraw my petition. I want to return to the original custody arrangement immediately." Jake felt tears stinging his eyes. "Mr. Morrison, approach the bench, please." Jake stood on shaky legs and walked toward the judge. She leaned forward, her voice low, but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, what happened to you and your family is unconscionable. Faced, I want you to know that I'm referring this entire matter to the prosecutor's office for additional charges against Ms. Thornfield, including conspiracy to interfere with a custody arrangement." "Thank you, Your Honor. However, Judge," Wells continued, "I also want to commend you for the way you handled this situation. You could have responded with anger and retaliation, but instead you sought legal remedies and documented evidence." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "One more thing," Judge Wells said. "Ms. Thornfield's actions have caused you significant emotional and financial distress. I'm ordering her to pay all of your legal fees and court costs. That includes any future therapy costs for you or your daughter related to this harassment." As Jake returned to his seat, he heard his phone buzzing with notifications. The live stream of the hearing had reached hundreds of thousands of viewers, and hashtag Justice for Jake was now trending alongside hashtag Poolgate Scandal. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Emma would be coming home this weekend, and they could finally go. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in his backyard on a crisp January morning, watching the construction crew dismantle the last remnants of Margaret Thornfield's illegal surveillance equipment. The hidden cameras, the recording devices, the elaborate network of spying technology that had turned his neighborhood into a prison, all of it was finally being removed under federal court order. "Dad, look what I found," Emma called out from near the rose bushes where Margaret's secret rental unit had once stood. She was holding up a small piece of metal that glinted in the winter sunlight. Jake walked over and examined the object. It was a fragment of one of Margaret's cameras, crushed and twisted beyond recognition. "What do you think we should do with it, sweetheart?" Emma considered this with the serious expression she wore when making important decisions. "We should bury it," she said finally. like a funeral for all the bad stuff. Jake smiled and ruffled his daughter's hair. Emma had been in therapy for 3 months to help her process the trauma of having her privacy violated by Margaret's surveillance. But she was resilient in the way that only children can be. She understood that a bad person had tried to hurt their family, but that good people had helped them win. "That's a perfect idea," Jake said. "We'll have a burial ceremony for all the bad stuff." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and gradual healing. Margaret Thornfield had pleaded guilty to 17 felony charges, including fraud, embezzlement, stalking, conspiracy, and violation of federal privacy laws. She'd been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $400,000 to her victims. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately positive. Jake's story had sparked a national conversation about HOA overreach and the need for oversight of neighborhood associations. Several states had passed new laws requiring transparency and limiting the enforcement powers of HOAs, legislation that reporters had dubbed Jake's Law, but the real victory wasn't in the legal system or the media coverage, was in what had happened to Maple Ridge Estates itself. "Jake," Mrs. Chun's voice called from across the yard, "the new HOA board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Jake checked his watch and nodded. The neighborhood had reformed their homeowners association with proper bylaws, elected leadership, and transparent governance. Jake served as vice president, Mrs. Chen was treasurer, and David Kim had been elected president. Their first order of business had been to officially approve Jake's inflatable pool, along with 14 other violations that Margaret had fabricated over the years. "Come on, Emma," Jake said. "Let's go see how democracy is supposed to work." The meeting was held in Mrs. Chen's living room, the same space where they'd planned their resistance to Margaret's tyranny. But the atmosphere was completely different. Now, instead of fear and anger, there was laughter, collaboration, and genuine community spirit. "First item on the agenda," David Kim announced, "is the spring neighborhood barbecue. Sarah Martinez has volunteered to coordinate, and she's asking for input on activities. Pool volleyball," Emma shouted from her spot on the couch, earning chuckles from the adults. "I think we can arrange that," Sarah said with a grin. "We'll set up games in all the pools, inflatable and permanent alike." Jake looked around the room at faces that had become genuinely dear to him. These people had started as strangers, become allies in a war none of them had wanted to fight, and ended up as something more precious: real friends. "Actually," Jake said, raising his hand, "I have something to propose for the barbecue." The room quieted, and Jake stood up. "I know this might sound crazy, but I think we should invite Margaret Thornfield." The silence that followed was profound. Emma looked up at her father with wide eyes, and Mrs. Chen's expression suggested she might be concerned about Jake's mental health. "Jake," David Kim said carefully, "she's in federal prison." "I know, but she gets supervised visits, and she's been writing letters to some of the neighbors she victimized. Apparently, she's been in therapy and wants to make amends." "I'm not saying we forgive and forget," but Jake paused, trying to find the right words. Margaret Thornfield was a monster, but she was also a human being who lost her way. She destroyed her own life trying to control everyone else's. Maybe seeing what we've built, seeing how a real community functions, might help her understand what she lost. Tom Peterson, who'd become a regular at the neighborhood meetings, spoke up. "Jake, that's incredibly generous of you, considering what she put you through." "That's exactly why I want to do it," Jake replied. "Emma asked me the other day why Margaret tried to hurt us, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. Maybe this is a chance to find one." Mrs. Chen stood up slowly. "I think Jake is right. Margaret caused terrible damage, but she also brought us together. In a strange way, we owe our community to her villainy." All in favor of extending an invitation to Margaret Thornfield for supervised attendance at our spring barbecue? David Kim asked. To Jake's surprise, every hand in the room went up, even Emma's. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. Written in Margaret's precise handwriting on prison stationery, "Dear Jake and the residents of Maple Ridge Estates, I don't know how to begin to apologize for what I did to all of you. For 2 years, I convinced myself that I was protecting our neighborhood, maintaining standards, preserving property values, but the truth is, I was a tyrant who used fear and intimidation to control people who had never done anything wrong. I've been in therapy for 6 months, and I'm finally beginning to understand how deeply sick my behavior was. I violated your privacy, manipulated your legal proceedings, and tried to destroy families out of some twisted need for power and control. Jake, you had every right to hate me. Instead, you've offered me something I don't deserve, a chance to see what I could have been part of if I hadn't been so consumed with being in charge of everything. I would be honored to attend your barbecue, not as someone seeking forgiveness. I don't deserve that, but as someone hoping to learn what real community looks like. I know I can never undo the damage I caused, but maybe I can at least acknowledge it properly. With sincere remorse, Margaret Thornfield, Jake folded the letter and looked out his kitchen window at the neighborhood that had become his true home. The spring barbecue was still 2 months away, but he could already imagine it. Children playing in pools and sprinklers, neighbors sharing food and stories, laughter echoing through yards that had once been filled with fear. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a broken woman learning what she'd almost destroyed. The day of the barbecue arrived with perfect spring weather. Jake stood at his grill, flipping burgers and watching Emma play pool volleyball with a group of neighborhood kids. The inflatable pool that had started this whole saga was now the centerpiece of an elaborate water play area that included 3 other pools, multiple sprinklers, and enough pool noodles to stock a sporting goods store. At 2:30 p.m., a white van pulled up to the curb. 2 corrections officers got out, followed by a woman Jake barely recognized. Margaret Thornfield looked smaller, somehow diminished. Her hair was shorter and streaked with more gray, her face lined with what looked like genuine remorse. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small bouquet of flowers. The conversation in the neighborhood gradually quieted as people noticed her arrival. Jake set down his spatula and walked over to meet her. "Margaret?" he said simply. "Jake," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for this. I know I don't deserve it. Nobody deserves kindness, Margaret. That's what makes it kindness." She looked around at the scene children, playing neighbors laughing, the easy camaraderie of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Her eyes filled with tears. "This is what I always said I wanted," she said quietly. "A perfect neighborhood. But I never understood that perfection isn't about control, it's about connection." Mrs. Chen approached, carrying a plate of her famous dumplings. Margaret accepted the plate with shaking hands. "Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology. I violated your privacy, threatened your family, and made your life a nightmare. I'm so sorry." "We all make mistakes, dear," Mrs. Chen said gently. "The important thing is learning from them." For the next 2 hours, Jake watched as Margaret moved through the party like a ghost of her former self. She apologized to each neighbor individually, listened to stories about how their community had flourished since her removal, and observed the kind of genuine neighborhood harmony she'd claimed to champion, but had never actually understood. When it was time for her to leave, Margaret approached Jake one final time. "Jake, I need you to know something," she said. "Watching Emma play today, seeing how happy and secure she is, I finally understand what I almost took from you. I tried to destroy the most important thing in your life because I was jealous of your happiness." "Why?" Jake asked. "Why did you target us?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Because you were everything I wasn't. You were a loving father, a good neighbor, someone who found joy in simple things. I'd spent so long trying to control everything that I'd forgotten how to just ... live." She looked at the inflatable pool where Emma was still playing. A $67 pool brought you more hap,